How many Ram trucks do they have in Philly?
Quite a few, actually. But yeah. Especially the offensive linemen. You know,
All right.
right?
I
There we
love that
go.
offensive line. It's one of the most likable groups, I think, in the NFL.
Sure.
Zach Berman, PHLY Eagles, joins us here out live at Radio Row. And, I mean, we'll see if we've seen the last days of Jason Kelce. But, I mean, you know, the Christmas album they always drop, it's a fun crew.
Absolutely. And it's kind of how they built their team. And it's rare to have your offensive line as like the faces of the franchise.
Yeah.
But in Philly, between Jason Kelce, Lane Johnson, Jordan Mailata, like, for instance, Jordan Mailata, Lane Kelce went to the White House this year for a Christmas party to sing. You don't see that with a lot of offensive lines. So at this time last year, I was in Phoenix for the Super Bowl, and those linemen were as popular as anyone else during like the whole media night. So that goes to show you it's a little different in Philly in terms of the O-line.
I wasn't seeing Jason Kelce there at the Chiefs-Bills game, shirtless, just slamming beers and kind of throw it in the face of Bills fans there, the Bills Mafia.
That's not surprising. I've known Jason. I've covered 13 years of his career, 12 of his 13 years, and that's his personality, right? He fits right in tailgating as much as he does playing offensive line.
Isn't it crazy that it's coming to an end that you covered pretty much from wire to wire for a guy like that?
It's crazy. I'm not sold that it's the end until he actually says it. I know that's where he's leaning. Yeah. But you know, Jason always said that he's going to know when to retire when he doesn't want to go anymore. And you know, Jeff Stoutland told him that. The offensive line coach told him that. And Jason would say, well, I'm always going to want to go. And Jeff Stoutland said, no, there's going to come a time when you're just going to be like, oh, man, I got to go play. Yeah. And so we'll see if that happens. I think he's leaning that way, but I also think he loves the locker room. He loves the cafeteria. I don't think he wants to give that up.
Don't you think it would benefit him if they made the tush push illegal? He'd be like, damn, this is gonna save my career here. Maybe lots of bumps and bruises.
Yeah, I mean he's told stories about the bottom of that pile, and it doesn't sound fun. Better him than me, right? So
every time I see that, I always wonder, like, dude, that can't be as easy as it looks, especially for those guys.
No, so it's easier for Jalen Hurts than it is for Jason Kelce, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens. Like they're on the bottom of that pile. Those guys are doing all kinds of things to them. Yeah. And the whole strength of the play is Jason Kelce getting low, like getting underneath you. And you know, Gannon, he knew that was coming when the Eagles played them. Like that's their kind of trademark play. And it's much much easier to discuss than it is to actually execute.
Yeah, the Cardinals stole it, and they would have Clayton Tune, the rookie quarterback, going and running instead of Kyler Murray.
They didn't look the same. They didn't look the same.
That's true.
But I mean, Yellow Froholt, who played the role of Jason Kelce, did it pretty well. You talk about a year ago today. You're covering this Eagles team. You know that it seemed like that window just went wide open as far as Super Bowl window. But things can obviously in the NFL, in the cap league. You know, the shelf life of these players at premium positions isn't as long as people think it is. I mean, where are the Eagles right now? I mean, after a first-round loss, Super Wild Card weekend, they lose to the Bucs. What's the state of the organization?
Well, transition right now because they're replacing both coordinators. And they did it last year on the coordinator's accord, right? Both got head coaching jobs. And now they're in a situation where they fired both. Because they were 10-1. There was a point there in the middle of the year where I thought we'd all be here talking about the Eagles, right? Like they were near the top of the NFL. They beat the Chiefs. They beat the Bills. You know, they beat the Dolphins. They beat the Cowboys, and then the bottom just fell out underneath them. There was a handful of things. The defense was a major problem. Personnel-wise, I think they missed Gannon coaching. They really missed the players that they had on that defense, but really, it comes to, you talk about where the franchise is. If Jalen Hurts plays like he did 2 years ago, they're in contention for this game every year, right? If you have an MVP caliber quarterback, it's similar, by the way, to Kyler. A few years ago when they were 10-1 with Kingsbury, right? And then if the quarterback gets hurt or the quarterback underperforms, it changes everything. So I think they have a lot of young talent, especially. You know, they have perhaps the best wide receiver combo in the league, depending on what happens in Cincinnati here with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. They have strength on the lines of scrimmage, but they need to figure out the back end of their defense, and Jalen needs to play at an MVP level for them to be the team that they can be.
When you covering the Eagles, obviously, and as that downward spiral started to take place, everybody, there was a lot of people that pointed to JG not being there and the gap there. What was it like when the Cardinals came into Philadelphia and won that game? What was it like behind the scenes going to cover that team?
Yeah, that was an interesting week because, I remember talking to Bo and Johnny about it, and like that was Gannon's Super Bowl. That's I think internally in the organization they kind of felt like this one means something to Gannon. Even though Gannon kept saying,
downplayed
downplayed it. The way he exited, the way kind of I think the city felt about him, all that went down with the tampering. I think it was personal to Jonathan, and he showed it. Now that loss signaled that there was a major problem.
Yeah.
And I say that because when you lose to San Francisco, when you lose to Dallas, even when you lose to Seattle, it's like, all right, this is a tough schedule. These are tough games on the road. But when you lose to Arizona at home, when you have a chance to kind of be in the driver's seat in the NFC East, a chance to get that 1 seed at that point, that was problematic. So I think that was an indication that this wasn't just an aberration, that there was problems with the team.
Yeah, let's get into that tampering conversation. I want to get it from the Philly perspective. We got Florio's perspective, who some people call like a conspiracy theorist, right? And he goes in and he doesn't, beat around the bush. He thinks that it compromised how JG prepared for this game. Like ESPN had like a report that Vic Fangio and others were saying it ruined lives, and I don't know if there's hyperbole there, but like what from your perspective, what was it true? What went down from what you can report?
Yeah, I don't think it affected the Super Bowl. It affected after the Super Bowl. And what I mean by that is I do think Vic Fangio would have been the defensive coordinator last year had they known that Gannon was going to get a head coaching job. So basically what I can say is that Gannon is interviewing for the Texans job. He doesn't get it, right? So he thought he was coming back to Philly. And the organization thought he was coming back to Philly.
After the conference championship
Exactly,
game.
yeah. And so then at that point, Vic Fangio, he's going to Miami because he was in place for the Eagles to replace Gannon. The Eagles, all along, they would say they were renting Gannon. They figured that Gannon was getting a head coaching job. He came close, frankly, after his first year to getting the Houston job. So when that happens, all right, internally, the Eagles are like, Gannon's coming back. Vic takes that Miami job. Had the Eagles known during the early run to the Super Bowl week that Gannon was a candidate elsewhere, they probably would have held on to Vic, or Vic would have held off. And I say that because, and this is why I don't think the Super Bowl preparation was compromised in that Shane Steichen interviewed for the Colts job at that same period of time. Right? It did, and
it was just within the rules,
exactly.
Right? It was his second interview.
Yes.
The Cardinals hadn't had their initial interview with Gannon because he talked to Houston, as you said, and then D'Amico Ryans, they had VIP access to the top coordinator candidate, and that just kind of became, he took that job. So it's really fascinating, like how things broke down, and that Steichen is perceived as this like did it right, and then JG's ruining lives and just leaving a wake of just destruction in his.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I would actually say I don't think this is hyperbole. Steichen probably spent more time interviewing that week than Gannon did. The only difference is because Steichen's was above board, to use that term, if you will. The Eagles kind of had their succession plan ready when Steichen got that Colts job. They were caught off guard by Gannon getting the Cardinals job, and that's why they had to do a search after the Super Bowl, and they didn't get the guy that they kind of had hoped for all along. Now the irony is they have Vic Fangio now. But I think that's where the bad blood from the tampering comes down, is that had they known Gannon was going to get that Cardinals job, they would have kept Vic, or Vic Fangio would have wanted to stay in Philly.
Is there any fallout with Rawlis following him?
Yes. That's a good question. I think if Nick Sirianni had his preference, it would be like, all right, you get this job, but don't poach our staff. Now, the irony there is that Nick brought Gannon with him from Indianapolis. So it's almost like do as you say, not as you do. You know? But yeah, I think that all along I had kind of known that Nick Rawlis was going to follow Gannon. He was Gannon's guy.
Yeah.
He was Gannon's hire. He was Gannon's guy in that building. Now, Nick was very well regarded. And I do think that if they promoted internally, it would have been Nick Rawlis. But I think Nick was going with Gannon no matter what.
Let me ask you this, unless you got something solved.
No, go ahead.
I mean, when you look at this Philly roster, and it looks like there's going to be, significant turnover, some key free agents. Do you see anybody as a Rollis or JG guy that could potentially follow him, like a Kazir White did last offseason?
That's interesting. Now, the Eagles' personnel wasn't particularly good this year.
Yeah.
But I would say that if Fletcher Cox were to play somewhere else next year, and I don't think that's going to be the case. I think if he comes back and be in Philly, I think the closest he came to leaving was last year. But then I could see that, and kind of the interesting thing is I don't think Fletcher and Jonathan saw eye to eye at the beginning.
I heard that too.
But then later on, I think they did. But no, I think last year a guy like Javon Hargrave, who's playing in the Super Bowl for the 49ers, he would have made sense. Probably not at the stage that the Cardinals were in rebuilding-wise. But, no, I think personnel-wise for the Eagles, a lot of, the Gannon guys aren't necessarily there anymore.
Right.
Marcus Epps was a guy he really
here.
liked. Yeah. And so, yeah, I wouldn't look out for that unless, for instance, if James Bradbury were to get cut. And Bradbury's coming off a bad year. The Eagles would have to eat a lot of money if they did that. But if Gannon's all right, I've seen this guy play at a high level. Gannon always talks about football character. James Bradbury has that. Then maybe as kind of like a low price reclamation project. But I think last year's roster was probably more conducive to bringing in Gannon imports. One
of the things that when you guys struggled that last section of the year. And you can't really put a finger on what is going on with this team. Sometimes that leads to things are happening behind the scenes that maybe we don't know about, right? Yeah. How vital do you think Gannon might have been in kind of just keeping that together a little bit, at least on the defensive side? Because we saw the Cardinals did not have that much talent on that roster, but they played their asses off just about every single game of the 17-game skid. So I don't know.
Well, I'm unpopular in Philadelphia for saying this part. That I think Gannon's a really good coach, and I think they did miss him.
Yeah.
Now, I think they missed
him. You tell Bo Wolf that every day?
Yeah. Bo and I get in that debate all the time. Now, I think they missed the personnel more than they missed Gannon, right? I mean, Gannon had great players, but I think the continuity that they had year one to year two, Gannon really had a vision for that defense, and they were able to execute on that vision. And I think last year, one of the things that was missing was I don't think the communication between the way Sean Desai wanted the defense to look and the way the personnel kind of executed it was aligned. And I think they had that with Gannon. So if I had to say, they missed C.J. Gardner-Johnson and T.J. Edwards and Kaiser White and Marcus Epps and Javon Hargrave. They missed those guys more than they missed Gannon. But I do think that they missed Gannon. I think if Gannon came back, some of the issues you might have seen communication-wise they would not have been there. And the other thing, too, is I think Gannon really had a connection with Howie Roseman in terms of what that roster was going to look like, the composition. Yeah. And I'm not sure that was there this past year.
So I guess that fire in the gut was kind of doused, huh?
Yeah.
I think there's a better chance T.O. comes back than Jonathan Gannon at this point.
Yeah. Jonathan Gannon's not very popular in Philly. I can tell you that.
Yeah. It was when you have a divorce, I think both parties are happy with where they are now. Sure. I mean, even though Philly finally gets their guy in Fangio, and then they bring in Kellen Moore. It's really going to be fascinating to see how if they can get back on track next year. Zach Berman, PHLY, man, thank you so much for joining us here on Radio Row.
Absolutely, this was fun. I enjoyed it.
Let's catch up again.
It's great being part of the All City family.
Absolutely.
Go, baby.
All right, man. Are you up, by the way? You hit the tables yet?
I haven't hit, but we got in late last night. But I'll be playing blackjack some.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know how we go. Let's go, baby.